So joining me now is former U.S. Air Force Assistant Vice Chief of Staff and NewsNation Senior National Security Contributor, retired Lieutenant General Richard Newton. General Newton, thank you for joining us today. As we're talking about, here, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said this about the handover of the Bibas family.
All of Israel is united in grief. And as the Prime Minister of Israel, I vow that I will not rest until the savages who executed our hostages are brought to justice. They do not deserve to walk this earth. Nothing will stop me. Nothing.
Yeah, given his strong words there, I am curious your thoughts on what we could see in terms of a military reprisal for the deaths of the Bibas family.
Well, good morning, Alicia. It's been quite a spectacle, frankly, the last several hostage releases that Hamas has put on display. But especially as we see Shiri Bibas here with her two young sons were killed at the hands of Hamas, and then their bodies turned over just a couple days or so ago. And finally, her body was returned to Israel after an unidentified Palestinian woman apparently was first thought to be handed over. But nonetheless, I think as Prime Minister Netanyahu says, this is barbaric, this is savagery, and frankly, Hamas is going to pay. If there was any glint of hope, I believe, of perhaps falling through phase two, which is the most difficult aspect of the ceasefire negotiations, to come up with a permanent ceasefire, supposedly. That's falling by the wayside, because I believe that there's two conflicting things inside of these peacetime negotiations. One is the fact that Hamas wants to remain governing Gaza and frankly, to survive to fight another day. The other aspect of the ceasefire negotiations in phase two is for all of the Israeli Defense Forces to leave Gaza. I don't think those two situations are going to survive. In fact, they're going to collide. And that's really where I think what's going to be happening next in terms of the phase two that we're going to see unfold here shortly.
That's certainly what everyone has their eye on. A moment ago, you were talking about the Bibas family, and we showed pictures of those two little boys, that mother. It's really hard to process what has happened to them. But we know the Bibas family has really been critical of Prime Minister Netanyahu's handling of hostages. Family member Afri Bibas Levy said this, quote, he said, "There is no forgiveness for abandoning them on October 7th and no forgiveness for abandoning them in captivity. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, we did not receive an apology from you in this painful moment." Now, Afri Bibas said that again in a statement. Upon learning, though, that Shiri's remains had been returned today, the Bibas family, I wanted to read this quote for you, had this to say more broadly. They say, "In this difficult time, we continue to demand the immediate return of all the remaining hostages. Nothing is more important than that. There will be no healing without them." Does the Bibas family have a point here? Should Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, right now especially, be prioritizing diplomacy rather than revenge?
Well, there's certainly a lot of emotions running high, and they're raw at this point, certainly over the fact that you have around 65 hostages still remain, as the Bibas family points out, and likely half of them are dead. In terms of apologies, in terms of next steps and so forth, and do you take a diplomatic approach or do you take a military approach? I think you need to do both. I think in what Prime Minister Netanyahu is going to do, he will engage with negotiations mediated by the United States, mediated by Qatar, and Egypt and so forth. But nonetheless, I think you're going to see a diplomatic approach, but also the barbaric and frankly the spectacle of these hostage releases. And what Hamas did literally to the Bibas family, it does call for Prime Minister Netanyahu, and frankly, in order to protect, the sovereignty of Israel, that he may indeed feel compelled, and I would support him, to go finally finish the job, destroy Hamas so that they're no longer a threat to future Bibas families and future Israeli citizens who are now literally in harm's way because of these terrorist organizations.
To that point there, I think one major question that still lingers is how this confusion happened over Shiri's body, how it happened in the first place. Hamas did offer an explanation earlier this week, saying in a statement, we also point to the possibility of an error or overlap in the remains resulting from the occupation's targeting and bombing of the place where the family was present, along with other Palestinians. Do you buy that explanation, or is this another example of what some say is Hamas's calculated cruelty?
Not at all. This is part of their information war campaign, part of the psychological warfare they're trying to do against the Israeli people. And also, if you look at the now published forensics done on the bodies of those two young Bibas family boys, that they weren't killed by a bomb or some type of explosion, but they were literally killed at the hands and presumably at the hands of the Hamas terrorists. And I think you're going to find with the forensics of Mrs. Bibas as well, most likely. And so the forensics and the actual CSI aspect of this will underscore the fact that this is all done at the hands of Hamas. And let me remind the American people, October 7th is at the hands of Hamas. They're the ones that killed 1,200 Israeli citizens. They're the one that took 250 hostages. Exactly where we are today is because of this terrorist organization. Yeah. And so forth. And I believe that, again, going back to our discussion at the beginning of the conversation, this is why Prime Minister Netanyahu, yes, has to approach this from a negotiation standpoint in phase 2, but also he's got the capability, and he certainly has the support of President Trump in the United States, that if indeed Hamas is given any modicum of survival, that he cannot let that happen. And I believe that's why Israeli Defense Forces still have the capability to go in and finally destroy Hamas.
Yeah, there's certainly a delicate balance that has to happen here, and we'll continue to follow it. I want to turn for a second to Ukraine, where President Trump and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky really have been exchanging and engaging in a war of words following some high-level meetings between the U.S. and Russia this week. We have been an ally of Ukraine over the better part of this war. Is Ukraine now in some trouble with the U.S.?
I don't think so at this point. It is rather disappointing that you've got, both President Trump and President Zelensky engaging publicly in a spat, if you will. It's over two things, Alicia. The first one is this idea of, President Zelensky or Ukraine not having been invited to the senior leader discussions in Riyadh on Monday. That was really to reset the United States relationship with Russia, but also to really determine if Putin and his leaders are serious about ensuing ceasefire negotiations. By the way, the jury is still out on that, but nonetheless, that was the purpose on Monday. Secondly, it's also been over this idea of a mineral agreement, an economic agreement that the United States put as a proposal to President Zelensky, which really, in my view, bolsters the relationship between the United States and Ukraine. It also offers up this economic agreement is really the best strategy in terms of a security guarantee if you have the United States and Ukraine in an economic financial agreement, not for the short term, but for the long term. And reportedly, as I understand it, my sources tell me President Zelensky is getting closer and closer to signing that mineral agreement. And I think that will draw President Trump and President Zelensky back closer together. But I do believe that you're going to want to see a united front more so between the United States and Ukraine as we go head to head in what we presume will be negotiations for a ceasefire with Putin, because Putin cannot be trusted in any stretch of this. But it's going to really the whole purpose here is that United States has to lead this. United States has to consider what's in the best interest for the American people, but also really to close the deal in order to end this war that has killed and wounded millions on both sides of Ukraine and Russia.
Yeah, to your point there, that mineral deal in particular is something we're going to be following closely and could potentially lead to a rekindling of a more friendly relationship with Ukraine. I'd be remiss if I don't ask you about this. CQ Brown, I know you're familiar with him or know him. President Trump announcing the firing of the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. Want to get your thoughts on why do you think he made that move? What kind of effect you think that's going to have on our armed forces?
Well, it's going to send shockwaves to the Pentagon. I've known CQ Brown for years, both personally and professionally. He is the epitome of a warrior, of a leader, of the officer of the highest standards. And so it's rather disappointing that he's been relieved along with the chief of naval operations, the vice chief of the United States Air Force, and as I understand it, the Judge Advocate Generals of the Army, the Navy, and the Air Force. My concern here, bottom line, is the politicization of the military. You want your senior leaders, such as General C.Q. Brown, how he has served over the last 40 years, with strong leadership, with integrity, with professionalism, providing his best military advice, as well as, faithfully executing orders, that come down from the president and so forth. And so this is again, I'm very concerned about how we politicize moving forward by the firing of General Brown and others in this case. You do not want a litmus test of whether or not someone is politically bent towards the left or the right or Republican or Democrat. Apolitical. When I was nominated by President Bush, I was also nominated by President Obama and confirmed by the Senate. It was all done in an apolitical process. And that's very important for the American people to understand, that we need to keep the U.S. military, especially our senior leaders. Our job is to provide the best military advice without any apolitical consequences at all. And so this point right here of him firing General Brown and others last night, I believe we're on a dangerous, slippery slope here that is going to cause not ripples, but some shock and awe through the Pentagon for a period of time.
Well, we'll continue to watch. Really appreciate your time and your insight. Former U.S. Air Force Assistant Vice Chief of Staff and NewsNations Senior National Security Contributor, retired Lieutenant General Richard Newton. Thank you again.
Thank you. Good morning, Alicia.